This webinar is being delivered as part of GRDC-funded Seasonal Status of Pets and Diseases for Growers project. Excuse me, my name is Mariam Esanger. I'm PestFacts SA editor, and I'm hosting the webinar today. The Department of Primary Industries and Regions acknowledge the traditional custodians throughout South Australia and their continuing connection to the land, waters, and community. We pay our respects to all members of the Aboriginal community and their cultures, and to elders both past and present. In today's webinar, Dr. Martin van Helden will provide a seasonal outlook for grain establishment pests, while Dr. Lucas Hearn will discuss minimizing the economic impact of earwigs, millipedes, and slaters in Australian grains. We also have Michael McManus from the biosecurity team joining us to provide a recent update on the Australian flag locust situation.
2026, exciting for us entomologists, maybe a bit less exciting for all the farmers and agronomists, but yeah, a season full of surprises, and I'll try to give a bit of a explanation of why we see things happening and what's happening, and why we need to be aware that this might be an interesting season coming up. Let me say it that way. So this was the third consecutive dry summer that we had. This is the rainfall from November to January, and everybody was desperate for a bit of water to be able to grow some decent crops. Last year was not too bad. The year before was really hard. And we seem to be going the same way again with a very, very dry summer until the end of January, which, yeah, looked pretty difficult for growers. As for the insects, it showed a very limited green bridge. There was hardly anything growing. So we expected that the pest risk would actually be very low. And then came February, and that changed everything. So February 6th to 12th, rain came in, especially in the north, so in the outback. Huge quantities of rain, and that basically continued. So as you can see on this overview, from February to April, we've had good amounts of rain, especially in the outback, which is a bit unusual, but that's the way it is. This happens. This is Australia, resulting in a lot of growth, a lot of green bridge, and potentially good development of all kinds of insects. What's also quite interesting, and which also influences the current situation, is that in April the temperature stayed quite high. This is the temperature anomaly. So all the warmer colors, the yellows and the oranges and the reds, are temperatures above the normal temperature. And as you can see in South Australia, it was already 1 to 2 degrees above normal temperatures for April. And as you can see, there was an extreme warm period in Western Australia, north of the Nullarbor. So yeah, very warm with water, perfect for insects to develop. So if you look at the current situation, this is from earlier this week, root zone soil moisture levels. So how much water do we have in the soil? As you can see, completely different from the previous years when we had mostly red. In this case, we have lots of white for the cropping zone, but also quite a lot of blue. It's just an amazing year with lots of water in the outback, lots of green in the outback, and that is not going to stay without consequences. So farmers were very happy because rain, early break, moisture available, April still warm, early sowing opportunity. So everybody, I think, has gone for that and has already sown or is currently sowing. I presume it has influenced crop choices a bit. Maybe a bit more canola went in than usual, which is always a good break crop, especially if you want to think of things like suppressing a bit of your weeds. But it also is great for green bridge development. All kinds of weeds started to grow very early after those rains in February. Of course, you spray your green bridge before you start sowing, but you cannot spray outside of where you are cropping. Insects will develop. They love moisture. They love the warm temperatures. And it's also warm enough for them to still show migrations. That's where April was really atypical. Those high temperatures are great for insects. If they want to move, they can move when it's warm enough. So if you look at the reporting that we have received here at Saudi Entomology, we've had all kinds of huge, well, I wouldn't say outbreaks, but large amount of reporting. Birdworm started very early in the season. I'll give some more details later. Green peach aphid, I will also show a bit more information. And locusts, which we will have Michael McManus a bit later on, but we also had things like rhododendron bugs, leafhoppers, mirids, diamondback moth, cowpea aphids, cutworms that were reported. A little bit of mites and lucerne flea, not that much, but yeah, globally speaking, all migratory pests that you can imagine started to move and have been giving more pressure than usual, I would say. Whereas the resident pest, there was only red-legged earthmite and lucerne flea that were sometimes reported. Red-legged earthmite actually very little. We had some other mites. These are insects or organisms that over summer in the egg stage, so they're not suffering too much from the intense drought and heat at the middle of the summer, but they react very quickly. If there's rain and cooler temperatures, they will start developing, and that's what's happening with mites and lucerne fleas at the moment. So typically a year for migratory pests, and I'll show you a bit more detail about some of them. What's also important to see is where we did not get any reporting on, because let's consider that as good news. We have had here at Saudi almost no reports on earwigs, slaters, millipedes, slugs, and snails. That's probably the result of all these years of dry summers. They have just been slowly decreasing, which is good. We've had no Russian reed aphids. I have seen a few here on campus in the city, but that's about it. I haven't seen them at all in the cropping areas. Maybe somebody has. I'd like to know that. And we haven't seen any real red-legged earthmites so far, but that's probably because it's still a bit too early for the red-legged earthmite eggs to hatch, because they need lower temperatures, not just rainfall, also lower temperatures, and we haven't had enough lower temperatures. So in all, I think the resident pest pressure was actually reduced because of all these droughts that we've had. They will build up again. Lucas will tell you the story about that, especially when there's a lot of moisture, which we have this year. So probably, if it's not a problem this year, it could potentially be a bit worse next year, but I'll let Lucas talk about that. That's not my subject for today. So the main issues we've had, and a bit surprising for us, budworms. So if you remember last year in spring, we had quite a bit of native budworm, and this year, very early in March, April, we got reports of large flights of moths from the northern EP, and also caterpillars in pastures doing damage, really eating a lot of the plants in there, both EP and in the mid-north. And initially we thought it would be also native budworms, but it turned out to be a different budworm, which is called the lesser budworm. It's even worse if you look at the scientific names, because this is Helicoverpa punctifera, whereas the native budworm is Helicoverpa punctigera. So only one letter difference, and it's not that easy to see the difference between them. I've got the photos here on the screen. The main characteristic that we use, because these caterpillars are quite variable, as you can see, there's on the left the lesser budworm and the two on the right are native budworms. But what is important, and you can see that quite well on the left photo, the lesser budworm has got those white hairs on their body rather than the black hairs that you can see on the native budworm. So what's the consequence of all that? Well, lesser budworm is actually a species that you do. This was maybe a bit reinforced because of the early breeding that they've done in the outback. They then started to migrate to the EP. And they do sometimes attack cereals more than the native budworm. So that could be a bit of risk, but at the same time, we don't get any reports in at the moment. I think it's basically solved the issue there. And we're not expecting any issues with lesser budworm. However, the native budworm, the same as we had last year, Helicoverpa punctigera, the ones that we saw this autumn were probably some leftovers from last spring's invasion. They would normally disappear over winter because it's really getting too cold for them. However, they will almost certainly be breeding up in the outback, and then they could give extra pressure in spring, just like last year. So that's the big warning that we have already. The populations are there. We will start the monitoring with the traps as we usually do in June. And please keep your eyes open because these might be more important than we normally have. I'm not saying there will be. Keep your eyes open, keep monitoring, and we'll see what happens. Green peach aphids, over the last few years we've had little problems with green peach aphid. It was just too dry. There was no green breach, very little issues with aphids infesting canola with viruses. However, this year with the green breach, it started way earlier. Aphids started to build up. We saw that in our second project that we're running at the moment. We've also been testing the weeds that are still surviving that were there for possible virus infestation, and there's quite a few. I think we'll be reporting on that soon. So the virus sources are there on the weedy plants. And we've had several reports, both from the far southeast and from the Clare region, for example, where early sown canola paddocks were heavily infested with green peach aphid and the virus. So I think this is really a year where you have to be very careful in the canola. And unfortunately, there's maybe not more that you can do at the moment if your canola is already growing. And if the aphids are already there, the virus might already be in there, and then you would expect virus to express itself pretty early in season here. Normally we see these kind of images only in spring. But yeah, this seems like a pretty heavy attack. Everybody always talks about the 2014 attack on the northern York Peninsula. This might be a larger scale. We'll see how it goes. And unfortunately, we don't have many efficient pesticides anymore. For those of you who did attend the GRDC updates, Paul Umina from CSER gave a good update on the efficiency of the seed treatments that clearly seems to be wearing off on green peach aphid. So yeah, over the last year, maybe the pesticides were not that efficient anymore, but there was not much aphids anyway, so not much of a problem. This year we have plenty of aphids, and clearly the pesticide not being as efficient as they used to be. So I'm afraid this might be a pretty serious problem this year. Keep us updated if you have observation, because we are really interested in the subject, and we have a GRDC project on that. Last big thing is locust. I will not say much more about this because Michael McManus should be online and will take over just after me. I just have one last slide. 2016 will keep giving, whether you like it or not. As an entomologist, I'm sorry, but I like seeing all these insects moving around. It's not only bad insects, it's only good insects. I'm really happy with the amount of reporting that we have received from agronomists and farmers. That's extremely helpful for us. We can't be all over SA all the time, so we need your kind of input. So please keep reporting. Be prepared for overall slightly higher pest pressure than you normally have. Possibly also more beneficials. We've already seen more beneficials than we normally see at this time of the year. So yeah, keep monitoring and please keep reporting. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone. So Michael McManus, I'm the SA Locust Commissioner. My normal role in PIRSA is looking after agricultural chemicals. So I'm familiar with quite a few of you in the agronomy world, but when we have locust issues, I get involved in that space as the Commissioner as well. All right, next slide. Oops. Sorry, it's gone the wrong way. If I can go backwards, there we go. Right. So situation summary. What we've got is reports of adult locusts started in pretty much the last week of April, maybe slightly earlier on northern and western Eyre Peninsula. And those reports of adult locusts, swarms on properties were from upper western Eyre Peninsula, the Riverland, Mallee regions, southern Flinders, and then down to the mid-north. So that all really kicked off in that last week of April. What PIRSA has been doing is logging the reports through the emergency plant pest hotline and the locations of those. We've been communicating with everyone about what where they're occurring and what they look like and how to report them. And a PestFacts article went out with that as well. We've been working really closely with the Australian Plague Locust Commission, who monitor the locust activity from a national perspective. And we've started doing some scoping surveying to seeing how far and these locusts have come into South Australia in terms of the risk to the cropping region and whether they're laying any eggs and what sort of activity they've got at the moment. So the Australian Plague Locust Commission certainly confirmed that there had been some building populations interstate, particularly since February, and likely also in the northern parts of South Australia, which reflect that rainfall map that Martin put up earlier. So with pretty suitable conditions for migration events at the end of April, locusts can fly hundreds of kilometres overnight, so it's not unusual that they suddenly appear after not being there before. So they've flown in from hundreds of kilometres away. We haven't had any early season crop damage from the emerging crops, but we're certainly aware that some producers have been spraying to protect threatened crops as they've been coming out because they've had pretty high locust numbers in a few isolated areas. There's two maps on this page. The map on the left-hand side is the reports that have come through to PIRSA. So we've been logging those, and that reflects what I put up on the slide before, mostly from the Riverland and Mallee region, a few in the pastoral Southern Flinders regions, but remembering that there's not a lot of population up there to report things, and a few on the sort of upper Eyre Peninsula, and really they do move across further to the west of that as well. The map on the right-hand side is what the Australian Plague Locust Commission have been doing. So they regularly do survey work for locusts as well. And as you'll see from that map, there's quite a bit of activity in the southwestern part of Queensland, through the central part of New South Wales, and certainly the north western corner there of New South Wales. They have been into South Australia to have a look, but generally the Australian Plague Locust Commission's role is to look at locusts that have the potential to move between states, so that they don't focus their activity in our state, because they don't tend to move across into the other states from us too much. So that's why their activities sort of focused in the other states. They did provide me with an update last night, so I'll just quickly go through that. And the current situations really occurred following that record-breaking rainfall you saw on the maps earlier in February. Due to the sort of long dry conditions we've had before that, the locust populations were generally low around Australia, except for a few medium density locust populations in that northwest corner of New South Wales. And there were certainly some isolated populations of locusts present in some of the Channel Country areas in southwest Queensland and in that northeast corner of South Australia in late 2025 and January 26. These isolated medium density populations have now had several successful laying cycles up until March, and that's resulted in the two migration events that we saw, which basically occurred across sort of 3 days in late April, when these where there's widespread medium density locust numbers have spread east across into central parts of New South Wales and south into parts of South Australia and the Mallee in Victoria. Whilst these medium density locusts are now present across a pretty large geographical area, which is similar to what we saw in 2010, the number of the large swarms and the overall density is certainly less than what we saw in 2010 when we had our last major outbreak. The number of migration events is also less than what we saw in 2010. However, there is going to be those widespread medium density locust populations around in the northwest of the state and in western New South Wales, southwest Queensland and parts of SA where those conditions have been suitable for breeding and egg laying. So there will certainly be medium density populations around. What they've really forecast in the last stop point here is, depending on our early spring break rainfall and the amount of rain in those areas, there's the potential for sort of band formations in some of these locations and a sort of further increase in the locust populations in September and October when they would hatch. So what happens is most of these locusts go into, they lay eggs and then they die off over winter, and we see the emerging populations of the new nymphs as they emerge in spring. So uncontrolled nymph bands in spring will fledge and are likely to migrate on weather patterns. So we might get some more reinvasion into South Australia from the eastern states, but that's less likely given the wind directions at that time of year. But we could certainly see populations in South Australia from emerging eggs come springtime. So what's PERS's response? We're communicating the situation and the risks. We're now conducting the surveys. So we're actually going out looking for egg laying and how widespread those locust migrations were, particularly in that southern Flinders region where we know that's where they breed up and that they then migrate into our cropping areas from that. But we're also keeping a very close watch on the Riverland area and on Upper Eyre Peninsula as well. So as I said, we're looking to determine the extent of any egg laying and the risk of the nymph fans developing in spring. But it's not easy to see that and monitor that, particularly in those remote pastoral areas. So we'll then plan and assess any need for a further spring monitoring when they're going to hatch and whether we PERSA need to have any response activities in terms of spray operations from a PERSA perspective. So just a reminder, the PERSA responsibility really with locusts is that surveying, and if required, we look at controlling locusts in those marginal agricultural and near pastoral areas of South Australia. And that's really to prevent the mass migration of locusts south into the higher value cropping areas. So PERSA really, when it looks at control program, it's really looking at pastoral country in most years and taking out big populations to prevent them moving into our high value ag production areas. Landholders are generally responsible for locusts in their own, reporting them and undertaking treatments of infestations on their own properties. So PERSA doesn't really get involved in cropping areas. I know it did in 2010, which was a really unique and the highest number of locusts we've ever seen, but typically we don't get involved in control programs in the cropping areas as such. In terms of locust control, just 2 slides left. Adult locusts are really mobile, so the ones we've seen migrate in are highly mobile. They move quickly between paddocks and districts, and they can reinvade treated areas and feed on crops and pastures where the local densities are high. They typically look for anything green, so that's the attractive part for them. So our advice at the moment for the migrations and the locusts that you can see around just now is to keep monitoring those crops in those high risk areas and along the paddock edges in particular where the adults tend to aggregate. And control in terms of spraying might be justified if there's really high density situations right next to crops to protect your crop establishment. But those applications need to be really well timed. Try and get insects when they're settled, such as early in the morning or late in the evening, and make sure you're following any chemical label instructions. Generally, our advice is probably not to worry about control because they do move quite quickly. But if you've got a crop under threat, then it probably is worth looking at control if you need to. In terms of what chemicals you can use, the APVMA website's got permits and registration information. You can put that into their PubCris system and you'll get that. But sort of in a summary sense, chlorpyrifos, which you used to use, is now restricted, so you can't use chlorpyrifos. Phenitrathione, which you used to be able to use, has also been recently restricted and will be phased out by August this year, so that can't be used. Malathion is, there's registered products for locust control with malathion. Fipronil is registered in pasture situations, but it's not for use in cropping situations. So we don't want fipronil residues contaminating our crops. And of course, it's pretty toxic to bees as well. So that fipronil use is certainly not for cropping situations. That's for pasture only. And there is a permit available, which does include a variety of chemicals. So I'd be looking, if you're looking at crop control, to use one of those chemicals and follow the label and permit directions for that. So if you look up that permit 10927 and you can use alpha cypermethrin or some of the sohalothins, then you've got some options there. Unfortunately, our chemical options have been restricted. APVMA have taken off a couple of the chemicals that we used to use for locust control. So we do have to be pretty careful and always remember that livestock residues, if you're treating in pastures, need to be really careful with that as well. There's some pretty significant withholding periods there. So I'll leave it at that and I'll take any questions at the end.
So my name's Lucas Hearn, and I'm just going to talk today about a recent GRDC investment looking at minimising the economic impact of earwigs, millipedes and slaters in Australian crop environments. And this project's being run by a team at Adelaide University. And so just to provide some context about how this project came to fruition. So essentially, the change in farming practices over the last 15 to 20 or so years to this no-till farming has essentially created this ideal habitat for certain insect species which require high moisture environments to survive. And then with this increase in these crop residues we're seeing, there's also been an increase in the reports of crop damage by European earwigs, Portuguese millipedes, and terrestrial slaters. And when we then combine this kind of change in these farming practices with the year-to-year environmental conditions we get, and also the recent restriction of certain chemistries used to manage these pests in the past, we see a potential for essentially an increase in the crop damage by these species. And especially in years such as this one, which Martin mentioned, which has experienced a very wet late summer and autumn compared to previous years. So potentially looking at a population boom for these pest species. And so essentially to tackle this issue, GRDC has invested in a project which will aim to look at the economic impact of these stubble pests and also fill some key knowledge gaps in their biology in these crop environments. And this project will be run by a team of researchers at Adelaide University, including Dr. Kate Muirhead, myself, and Dr. Kim Perry, with also collaborations from other research and farming groups as well. And so this project started mid last year and is running till 2028. So the species that we're targeting in this project have all been known pests for quite a while, and they all can be beneficial species in crop environments as well. So they've also been reported to inflict significant crop seedling damage at emergence. So, for instance, European earwigs will preferentially feed on protein sources in these environments, such as aphids and mites. But of course, when they're removed from the environment because they're pests themselves, they've then been reported to feed on live plant material. And similar for millipedes, which can contribute to nutrient cycling, which is obviously good for the soil, but they may also feed on these crop seedlings at emergence. And similar for the terrestrial isopod species, so while not much is really known about the damage associated with them and what crop varieties are actually targeting, lab experiments have shown that they will feed on live plant material in certain varieties, but again, not much is known about them in field environments. And essentially, all of these pests are very dependent on climate conditions, so their life cycles are tightly linked to it. And the population and activity is likely to essentially boom under favorable conditions, again, such as wet and warm late summers and autumns, which we've already experienced this year. So that could very much change their population numbers this year compared to previous years. And what we're essentially seeing from these species, from reports in the field, as well as lab trials that have been conducted, is both direct and indirect impacts. So we're seeing crop feeding in certain crop varieties. So direct feeding on canola and lentil are the two big ones, from earwigs and peelbugs especially. Earwigs potentially feeding on seed pods, or at least climbing onto seed pods at harvest, leading to contamination. And the key one for millipedes is actually the consumption of snail and slug baits before snail and slugs have the chance to move over them and consume them. And so this is actually quite a big issue. And I'll just show you some footage which kind of demonstrates that. So this is from last year in York Peninsula. So essentially after baiting, you see some millipede activity consuming the baits. And then a week and a half after baiting, you see they just absolutely hammer the bait before snails and slugs actually have the chance to consume it. And so this can be a really big issue in regions where they're trying to tackle both millipede pests and mollusk pests. And so that's something this project is also trying to kind of come up with a management solution for as well. And so while these species have been known pests for a long time, there's still really a lot we don't know about them in these grain crop environments. So we still don't really know the life cycle of the two slater species that we're investigating, the extent of damage that they're doing and associating damage to these pest species. And also quantifying the yield loss of these. So while a lot of lab trials have been done looking at feeding damage and yield loss, it might not necessarily be representative in actual real world crop environments. So this project will essentially aim to fill a lot of these knowledge gaps while also quantifying the economic impact of these pests are doing. And this will be achieved through a combination of roadshow surveys, interviewing agronomists and growers and researchers, some economic modelling, and also a variety of field and lab experiments to fill the knowledge gaps on the pest biology of these species. So a series of roadshows have already been conducted throughout Western Australia, South Australia, and Victoria. And these have been directed at, again, agronomists predominantly, and also some researchers and growers that have attended. And these surveys have essentially been designed to get a benchmark of the damage that these pests are doing and looking at how this changes based on region, crop type, and different farming practices. And we're also trying to provide an estimate to the economic damage that these pests are doing in each region. And so some of this roadshow data that we've collected will then feed into an economic model that's being developed by, in collaboration with the economics team at Adelaide University. And so this model will essentially incorporate various data such as species distribution models, crop production statistics from ABARES, and also our own yield loss data that we'll do from some lab trials. And this will hopefully allow us to demonstrate the economic cost of these pests and then ideally lead into the development of management solutions in the near future, such as a bait and potential baiting strategies that can be used. And another component of this project has been setting up trial sites throughout South Australia and Western Victoria to monitor pest behaviour and feeding activity at this early pre-sowing and pre-emergent stage. And so far we've got 4 experimental sites. So Tumby Bay in Eyre Peninsula, Minoura in Mid-North, Bordertown, and then Horsham in Western Victoria. And we are still looking for a 5th trial site in the Fleurieu Peninsula. So if anyone has a potential site for us, it would be great if you could reach out, and contact details will be at the end. And so essentially one thing we're doing in these experimental sites is setting up camera surveillance systems. And these have been developed in collaboration with Data Effects. And essentially at each site, there'll be 10 camera units placed into the crop and then 1 base station on the crop edge. And these camera units will essentially record pest activity and environmental conditions in real time every minute. And so these have been set up for a month now at our 4 sites that we've got. And what we're seeing essentially is, so pre-sowing, so this was about a month ago in the mid-north, so lots of millipede activity at the moment. It's a bit hard to see, it's moving very quickly. And then post-sowing, so this was over the weekend, the millipede activity has kind of dropped off. And though while it's hard to see, there is a lot of pill bug activity there. So we're already noticing this kind of shift in which pests are present based on time of year and crop timings. And another component that we're looking at, so we're wanting to investigate slater life cycles in these crop environments. So this will be done essentially by placing passive traps to collect slaters and assessing them every month. And they'll essentially be looking at the life stages in these paddocks and population numbers based on, again, crop timings and linking that to climate and how that influences their life history. Again, this will feed into potential strategies to implement baits and baiting timings. And then we're also trying to fill a gap by looking at slater feeding damage in various crop varieties, especially for the common slater, which hasn't been tested yet. And essentially what we have been seeing so far from this early stage in the year is that, yeah, like Martin said, this warm and wet February and autumn that we've had so far to start the year is potentially leading to higher earwig, millipede and slater numbers in paddocks than previous years where it's been a lot drier during this period. We've also been finding that these pests are favouring cracking black clay soil, which is topped with crop residues, and so essentially providing them this refuge to retreat to over summer. And this is creating potential for high numbers in consecutive years, depending on what the environmental conditions are like. So again, if we're getting wet springs and potentially wet autumns, then it could lead to population booms. And the addition of these restriction in chemical options to manage these pests, we might obviously see high damage in the future. So obviously a lot of chemistries have been taken away. I think the bifenthrin is probably the best option at the moment to manage these pests. And at the moment, we think that seed treatments aren't really doing anything. And yeah, of course, if you have any information or want any information on this project or these pests, feel free to reach out to any of the research team. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Lucas. So now it's time for questions. If you have any questions, please share them with us in chat box and we can address your question. Okay, so I think the presenters did great. So there is no question here, but if you have any question following the webinar, please don't hesitate to contact us. And thank you so much for your time today. We always want to hear more from you and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.